What if the official search was a lie? What if the greatest mystery in aviation history was not a navigational mistake, but a chilling act of political violence and a massive international cover-up? We have explored the logical terror of the deep-sea crash and the slow, agonizing despair of the castaway island. Both theories rely on the absolute indifference of nature. But today, we confront the ultimate, chilling possibility that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were not defeated by fuel consumption or a rogue tide. They were defeated by man. They were captured. This is the most controversial, dramatic, and persistent theory in the Earhart saga. The belief that the pioneers flew off course, landed in prohibited territory controlled by the Japanese Empire, and were subsequently imprisoned, interrogated, and possibly executed. It transforms the final chapter of their flight from a navigation failure into an intelligence nightmare, a prelude to the Pacific War itself. The year is 1937. The Pacific is not a serene, open ocean. It is a geopolitical powder keg. The world is watching the ascent of Japan, whose imperial military controlled a vast archipelago of mandated islands, the Marshall Islands, the Carolines, the Marianas, islands that were rapidly being fortified into secret military bases. These islands were known in Washington, D.C. as the Forbidden Zone. Any unauthorized foreign aircraft flying over them was considered an act of espionage. Earhart's planned route skimmed dangerously close to this forbidden zone. While her objective, Howland Island, was American territory, the route from Lae, New Guinea, could easily be swayed by unexpected weather, a fatigued navigator, or simple radio failure, placing the Lockheed Electra directly over one of Japan's most sensitive military secrets. The captivity theory posits that this is exactly what happened. Due to Noonan's reliance on celestial navigation and the poor radio conditions, they missed Howland Island by several hundred miles. Instead of correcting, they continued flying, their engines sputtering, until they sighted the unmistakable military footprint of a Japanese-controlled island, perhaps Saipan in the Marianas, or Jaluit Atoll in the Marshalls. They would have had no choice but to land. Imagine the sheer psychological terror of that landing. They don't touch down on a deserted reef. They land on a primitive, coral runway, only to be immediately surrounded by heavily armed Japanese Imperial Marines. The Electra, that cutting-edge American marvel, is seized. Earhart and Noonan, icons of Western freedom, are taken prisoner. The international incident, swift and absolute, is contained immediately, thousands of miles from the eyes of the world. Why capture them? To the Japanese, Earhart's long-distance flight path, an unprecedented route tracing the very supply lines and strategic choke points of the Pacific, would have looked suspiciously like reconnaissance. Her high-tech Electra, packed with advanced radio equipment and cameras, was a prize. Fred Noonan, an expert celestial navigator and former Pan Am route planner, was even more valuable. They weren't just civilians. They were potential spies who had seen too much of the Forbidden Zone. The nightmare begins. They are separated, subjected to intense interrogation. The beautiful, courageous Amelia Earhart, the darling of the American press, is reduced to a prisoner of war, facing the relentless, brutal questioning of the Kempeitai, Japanese military police. She is isolated, alone, and completely dependent on her captors. The silence that follows their disappearance is not the silence of the sea, but the deafening silence of a military detention cell. The theory hinges entirely on the possibility of a successful landing. Proponents argue that the lack of wreckage found near Howland is not evidence of the crash and sink theory, but evidence of a successful, controlled landing. The plane was intact and subsequently removed by the Japanese. This is the ultimate clean crime hypothesis. The evidence for the captivity theory is scattered, controversial, and often based on testimony that is impossible to verify, yet its collective weight fuels the persistent legend. The most compelling category comes from post-war eyewitness accounts gathered from American soldiers and local islanders who were in the region during the war. Dozens of veterans and local residents claim to have seen the Americans in captivity. On Saipan, numerous local Chamorro people recounted seeing a Caucasian woman and a tall Caucasian man being held in the old prison or at a government facility in Garapan. One common thread among these testimonies collected decades apart, was the sighting of a specific white woman and a tall, thin man who matched the descriptions of Earhart and Noonan perfectly. Some claim to have seen them executed. Others claimed they died in prison of disease or malnutrition before the American forces arrived in 1944. One particularly graphic and unsettling account came from U.S. Marine Sergeant Thomas E. Devine, who claimed that during the invasion of Saipan in 1944, he saw a grave marked Noonan and was told the bodies of the Americans had been moved. While many such accounts are hearsay, the sheer volume of detailed localized stories creates an unnerving picture. The theory gained significant traction from a controversial, unverified photograph. An image surfaced showing two figures, a light-skinned woman facing away from the camera, and a tall man, standing on a dock in Jalawat Atoll in the Marshall Islands, with a Japanese ship pulling what appears to be a plane fuselage in the background. Proponents argued this was Earhart and Noonan, captured just after landing. Critics, however, pointed out potential discrepancies and the possibility of the photo being doctored or misidentified, concluding the evidence was insufficient. Yet, the photograph became the visual heart of the conspiracy. The psychological horror of this theory lies in the unending limbo of their fate. They didn't die quickly in a plane crash. They died slowly, deprived of liberty, under the relentless pressure of military interrogation, forever separated from the world by political secrecy. The agony of being held captive, knowing that the greatest nation on earth was searching in the wrong place, unable to acknowledge their presence for fear of igniting a conflict, is a truly terrifying concept. The captivity theory then turns its gaze toward Washington, D.C. Why did the U.S. government abandon the search so quickly? The theory posits a terrifying truth: they knew. It is hypothesized that U.S. naval intelligence quickly learned of the capture, but was forced into a strict policy of denial. In 1937, the U.S. could not afford a war with Japan, and admitting that two American icons were caught spying, or mistakenly identified as such, in the Forbidden Zone would have provided a powerful justification for war or a massive diplomatic crisis. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, facing mounting domestic problems, allegedly made the cold calculation to declare them lost at sea, effectively sacrificing two heroes to preserve international peace, or at least to preserve the status quo until the U.S. military was ready for war. This would explain the rapid, almost immediate shift from search and rescue to missing and presumed lost, and the subsequent silence and classification of any information related to Japanese-mandated islands. The disappearance of Earhart was, under this theory, the U.S. government's first major intelligence loss and a political embarrassment that had to be buried beneath the myth of the lost heroine. Some proponents even speculate that during the intense fighting of the Pacific War, particularly on Saipan, American forces found the remnants of the Electra, or definite proof of the prisoners' deaths, but this information was immediately classified to prevent damaging the diplomatic narrative and to protect the families from the brutal truth of execution. The captivity theory is a narrative built on the shadows of human conflict and the sacrifices made in the name of political expediency. It is a story where the mystery is not geographical, but psychological. A conspiracy that asks us to trust no one, least of all the official records. The theory remains highly controversial. Critics correctly point out the inconsistencies and the unreliability of wartime witness testimony, often colored by trauma, confusion, or the desire for post-war compensation. They emphasize that the logistics of flying hundreds of miles off course, landing successfully, and being captured without leaving a single verifiable trace of the aircraft or pilot that could withstand forensic scrutiny strains credulity. Nevertheless, the captivity theory offers the most dramatic, most human, and perhaps most cynical conclusion to the Earhart mystery. It eliminates the random cruelty of nature and replaces it with the calculated cruelty of man. It provides a clean political reason for the enduring silence. The final prison of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, under this theory, was not the cold ocean or a desert island. It was the impenetrable silence of two nations bracing for war. Their death was not an accident. It was a consequence of flying too close to a forbidden secret. The legend of the great flyer lives on, preserved by the lack of definitive wreckage. But the captivity theory ensures that the mystery will always carry a darker, more haunting undertone, a suspicion that our heroes were not lost, but deliberately erased. The truth, if it lies in a forgotten Saipan prison or a classified wartime archive, is a piece of history that continues to resist all efforts to bring it into the light, leaving us forever to speculate about the fate sealed by a single terrifying word: captured.